There are two types of light that I want to explain and what type of effects that they have when you're using them and why you might want to use it, hard light versus soft light. First of all, I have been given examples of soft light, right? And what are the properties of soft light? So when you see a shadow and a highlight, you're going to see a very smooth transition between the lighted area and the darker area. That's when you know you're in a soft light situation, which is created by a very large light source. When you want to create soft light, you look for a place where there's no shadows or hardly any shadows at all, right? And a large light source. You can also create softer light by moving your subjects closer to the light source if that's possible. For example, if it's being used by a light source that's really huge and far away, it doesn't matter if they move 2 inches or 4 feet because still the light is coming from the sun, which is way far away. So just moving a few feet won't make a difference. But when you're in situations where you're using light by a window, it could be a huge difference between being 6 feet away from the window versus being 1 foot, and it could look completely different. So that's soft light, right? We talked about soft light a lot. Now let's talk a little bit about hard light and how it's created, because we're going to have to learn how to use hard light, especially when you're talking about shooting on location and natural light, because part of natural light is hard light too. But let's break it down a bit. Hard light, what are the characteristics of hard light? They are when you see sharp shadows. When you see sharp shadows on the ground, sharp shadows on your subject, then you know you are in a hard light situation. What creates that hard light? Well, when you're using a light source that is itty bitty, like if you look up at your light source and you measure it, this particular light here that's lighting me is relatively large and it's creating soft light on me. So if I look up at that light source and I actually measure it, I can see that that light source is about this big, which is huge, right? Let's say I'm looking up at the sun and I'm measuring the size of the sun. So if I were to go over here and measure the size of the sun, I go, well, okay, the sun's about that big, right? And so now the light source is small, it's going to create sharp shadows. But this light source, because of course it's not as bright as the sun, but it is bigger because it's closer to me. So hard light is caused by a very, very small source of light, and how you know it's small is just look up and measure it. If you measure it and it's about that big, then you know it's a small light source. So if you want to create harder light, you can move your subject away from the light and it will create sharper shadows. And so that's the difference between hard light and soft light. There's one other property of light I want to get into. I don't want to overwhelm you with stats and numbers and formulas. I just want to tell you a basic principle about the inverse square law. Now, I know that sounds like fancy mathematics and you might be running away from this video right now, but I'm just going to make it very simple for you. Let's take a look at this fun picture of myself, okay? Now I want to have you look at both of these photos. Both of these photos was created by the same light source and with an iPhone. Now they look completely different. Why is that? One, you see the background, and one, you don't see the background, but it's using the exact same light source. What did I do differently to get those different effects? And that is what the inverse square law. So the inverse square law tells you that the closer you get to the light source, let's say you're 1 foot away from the light source. That means that the light will travel 1 foot behind the light source and drop off. Okay? So if you're 10 feet away, if your light source is 10 feet away from your subject, the light is going to travel 10 feet towards your subject, then it's going to travel 10 feet behind your subject, and then drop off dramatically. And that's what you see in these two photos. The first photo, where I have a very, very dark background, I am literally 1 foot from the window. It's one window that's my light source. So in the first photo with the dark background, I'm 1 foot away from the light source. So what is it doing? It's traveling 1 foot towards me, 1 foot behind me, and then drastically dropping out. And that's why you see a dark background. The next photo, what did I do? I stepped back 10 feet from the window. So what happened? The light traveled from the window to me 10 feet, and it also traveled 10 feet behind me. And what did it do? It lit up the background behind me. That's the power of the inverse square law. Well, why would you want to learn that? Well, what happens if you want to take a photo of somebody and you want that background dark? You know the inverse square law. You know that if I move that light closer to the subject, the darker my background will be. Or maybe you want to take a photo where you can see the background. Well, the farther the light is away from your subject, the more background it's going to light up. And that's simply one aspect of the inverse square law that I want you to understand. So let me show you an example of the inverse square law. This is in the Bahamas, and I have this pretty model right next to the light source, which is the door. So I'm pushing her close to the light source, and you can see that the background is dark. Now I am going to move her, and so the door is the light source. Now I'm going to move her about 20 feet back from the door, and you can see on that next photo, the background behind her is completely lit. By moving her back, I get more of the background in view because it tells the story of that picture. Whereas in the first photo, I want that background darker because I want the subject only to be the story. So I am using the inverse square law to take and tell a better story of what I want to show in my picture.